Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shannon Q. I'm so excited. If you heard a little bit of banter before, it's just me trying to be quiet. I'm not very good at it. As it turns out, not so hot on trying to be quiet while we're getting the stream to go live. I'm really, really pumped today. I've been trying to get Katy here forever, but she's in England like a jerk, so our time zones don't line up very well. But as luck would have it, we're all on lockdown, so she's available to have a chat with me tonight. So, Katy,
I'm already several drinks in, so it's all good.
Cheers. I actually put rum in mine tonight. I'm not just Diet Coking, because this should be hopefully fun and informative. I'd like to lean towards fun, but fun can be informative, right? We could do both. Right, Katy? We've got this. So before we get started, I want everybody to have the opportunity to meet Katy and know where to find her. So Katy, tell everybody who you are and where they can find you.
Hi, I'm Katy Montgomerie. I'm a trans woman who likes to argue with dickheads on the internet. My Twitter is /Katy Montgomerie, and Katy is Katy, and Montgomerie is Montgomerie. So it's the other way around to what you're thinking. And I'm also a metalhead and an atheist and an electronic engineer.
So she's everything, is what she's saying. Like,
I'm all the things.
She's my dream girl, and I love her. And we met a while ago. That's right. We met a while ago because both of us ended up in a lot of the same Twitter strings, arguing with the same assholes about trans issues. So we kind of developed like an online friendship like a while ago, like a couple months ago.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed DMing with Katy. Like, I sent her pictures when I'm at the liquor store.
Yeah, that generated some argument. You sent me something and I posted it on my Facebook and I didn't realize how many Canadian friends I had. And they were like, which shop is that? How is that? Why is that there? I can't believe it. Which state is this? I was like, oh, I don't know.
It was Nova Scotia. Was that when I went into the liquor store and the cannabis? Did you post
Yeah. Like, I'm sure that's illegal. I'm sure that must be.
No, that's a government-run liquor store is what that is. That's not illegal at all. Not in Canada, it isn't. But today, Katy and I are going to talk about the worst anti-trans arguments. And Katy is a warrior. You are on Twitter all the time. Like, I don't know how you do it. It's either exhausting or exhilarating or both. Like, I don't know how you deal with it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it is exhausting. I think I'm like part of my main reason to do it is also I'm addicted to like logical arguments.
Mm-hmm.
I used to argue loads about atheism and I kind of got bored of it.
Yeah.
And I also used to argue a lot about music and I kind of got bored of that, like, because I get to the stage where I'm just totally confident with it.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone says something ridiculous, I just think, all right. But I guess, I'm only like coming up to 5 years into transition, and definitely at the start I was quite insecure about it. And that means that I want to argue about it more because someone will say something and I don't know if my position is logically sound necessarily, and I want to, find out if it isn't, and if I've got any flaws in it, I want to find them and get rid of them. And that's part of my driver and why I keep arguing with people. But also, yeah, it's quite satisfying sometimes when my favorite Twitter thing of all time is when someone says something and makes some logical assertion, and then I just keep asking them questions and directing them, and they'll say a different logical assertion, which is like 8 hours later, which is a direct contradiction of the original one, and they just link the original one back, and they're like, and they block me. So satisfying.
You're so good at it too. Like, there's been times that I've come into a string and we were talking about this before, and I'm about to say something, and you're there, and I'm like, oh, you beat me, Katy, you always beat me.
Yeah, one of my friends the other day was like, literally every single time I click on a thread, you've already written an answer to it. Like, what the fuck? And I'm like, yeah, okay, I do have a problem.
So, like, I don't know what it must be like for you, because, like, for somebody, I say like a lot. There's a joke on my channel. Every time I say like, you have to drink. So if you want to get really, every time I say like, take a drink. Try not to die. Try not to. It's going to be hard because I say like a lot. I don't have to, like, with you, see, Jesus Christ. With me, I don't have to live with the repercussions of the arguments that people are making because I'm cis. So I do it because it pisses me off because I have empathy and I recognize that people are people and I don't like people being assholes and I understand that I'm right in my positions. So, but there's no ultimate repercussions for me. Like when I go to bed at night, I don't have to worry about me not winning that argument might mean that I've armed somebody somehow. So like, are you okay? Like that must be hard because it directly affects you.
Yeah, I guess like I have burnt out a few times. I'm quite good at distancing myself from it. I always make a point to try and disengage my emotions and just treat it as just a logical battle. And I try and always keep on topic, and I try and stay really focused and not make it personal. And whenever I talk about this is my general advice to anyone who argues about anything really is, if it does affect you personally, never say, I do this, we think this. I always try and do, they do this, trans people think this, this applies to trans people, because it's so much easier as soon as you bring your own thing, because lots of these people, are acting in bad faith. And they'll say, I've seen some of my friends before, someone will say, trans women don't get raped. And then one of my friends will say, well, actually, my friend will say, I've been raped and it was really serious and they didn't know I was trans at the time and blah, blah, blah. And these people, they don't care at all and they'll just rip into it. And you've just laid all your emotions out and delved into something really painful for you and they don't care. And that hurts. So I think I always try and, distance myself from it in that way. Okay. But you can only do that for so long. And there's, however good at it you are, someone can always get a hook in somewhere. And so I think maybe 3 times I've had a proper burnout from it. And sometimes, like when something major happens, I mean, the UK press, I don't know how much you see of it in Canada, but like it's like the world authority on transphobia. Every single week, at least one of the major newspapers does an anti-trans article. The Sunday Times has done one literally every single Sunday for like 3 years now. And some of them hit harder than others. Some of them are just rubbish, small ones, but if they come up with some new idea or something and it kicks off, and it just means every single Sunday the whole internet is on fire with this new argument that all the idiots have been primed with. And it can get quite like demoralizing and stressful, and especially when you're arguing about actual laws that can affect you. Like at the moment in the UK, we've got this thing called GRA reform, which is currently you can update your birth certificate, but you have to go through a tedious process and there's extra hurdles that aren't necessary. And trans people have been campaigning to make that easier for, decades or whatever, since 2004, since they wrote the law. And people are fighting against that. And that does affect people I know, it does affect me. But then some other law, like, there are all kinds of things in other countries, like in America, where they're currently arguing whether you can fire someone just for being trans in the top court in the country. And, my friends could lose their jobs, they could lose their houses and everything over it. And it's quite heavy sometimes. But I just try and focus on staying, like, just keep it in the logical realm. And I just think that's what, like, stops me from burning out.
Okay. Well,
sorry, it's a bit of a rambly answer.
No, it's fantastic. So I'm really, I can't say it enough that I'm super glad that you're here so that people can hear what you have to say, because I love watching you. I love watching you like do your thing all over Twitter, and I want more people to know who you are and to follow you and to learn from you and to listen to you and to be engaged with you. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Like, really, I appreciate you taking the time. So would you like to get to some of the crappy arguments so that we can help educate some of the people in the audience how to counter and what they might engage in if they enter into the foray of this shitstorm?
What do you want, the dumbest arguments or the most common ones? I've prepared some common ones. I can think of some dumb ones.
Where would you start? You pick. I'll let you spin the wheel of stupidity, and you decide whether you want like a shit one. We could alternate even. We could do with like one you see most often, and then one that's just so dumb you can't believe somebody is making it.
So I guess one that maybe I'll start with, because it's relevant to your channel, is like the religious argument, which quite a lot of people, that is a big motivator for a lot of people. You don't see it so much in the UK because we're not a very religious country.
Mm-hmm.
You do see it, and you particularly see it from Americans, as you've probably encountered. But I guess when I do encounter religious people who are coming in with some anti-LGBT or anti-trans argument, I think it's easier when they're just focusing on trans people rather than LGBT people in general. That a lot of religious people are just normal, good people, and they don't hate trans people, they don't hate anyone, but they've been told by someone that God made you a man, and so you're going to be a man, you know. And I usually say to them, you know, whatever your religion is, what does your religion actually say, literally, about trans people? And as far as I know, none of the religions, major ones, say anything about trans people. Like sometimes they'll say something like a man's not allowed to wear women's clothes or something, and you just say, you know, well, they're not a man, they're not a woman.
And what are women's clothes also?
And what women, yeah, because like when they wrote that rule, perhaps the women's clothing isn't anything that anyone wears now. But like sometimes you can really just shake people out of it. I've had quite a few religious people say, you know, God made you a man or whatever, and you just say, well, you know, God obviously made trans people. Like, you don't need to say, because I always try and avoid doing your God doesn't exist, though I do write that in anger. You know, there's no point, because otherwise you end up in this conversation about God and they start cracking out all these like Quran quotes or whatever.
Yeah.
But if instead you just say, well, you know, trans people exist all over the world. God obviously created them, whatever your God is, and God gives people different challenges apparently. And, you know, obviously they've challenged trans people with this, and they've challenged you with something else. Right. And like quite a lot of people, they just realize that, oh, my holy text doesn't explicitly condemn it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of true. And I've had quite a few people just be like, oh, okay.
Yeah. A lot of religious people don't actually read their texts. They have them dictated to them and believe what they're told.
Yeah.
I was one of them.
Yeah, so it is a quite common argument. It's definitely not the most common, but I guess it's relevant to this, so I thought I'd say it first. Yeah.
So the one that I encounter, well, let's do a stupid one first, and then I'll do the one that I encounter that infuriates me the most, especially from a psychological perspective. So why don't you give me a stupid one? Give me one of the dumbest, most ridiculous ones.
One that really, so one I saw earlier today, which I see all the time, is trans women must be men, because if they weren't men, why would they want to transition into women?
Oh my God.
It's like, so it's what you're saying is this light must be off, because if it wasn't off, why would you have wanted to turn it on? It's like, but it's on. Like, I've turned it on. Like, transition means you change state. Like, I know, and they'll always have, you know, deep down they'll just believe trans women are men, and it doesn't matter necessarily. But the argument they presented is just so ridiculous. It's like you're saying someone must be what they used to be, because otherwise they wouldn't have changed to what they are now. Yeah, that's a very dumb argument that I encounter quite a lot. I would say twice a week I encounter that one.
That accidentally and seamlessly goes into mine, that I encounter all the time. All of the time. And that is that gender is a binary and is synonymous with, you know, sex assigned, like what your biological sex is. And that, it makes me feel like people don't even really understand gender norms and gender roles. So one of the things that I did on Twitter a while ago, I'm not sure if you saw it, because I'm not sure if we followed each other then, was I challenged Twitter to prove that I was a woman without access to my genetic profile or my genitals, which could change also.
Without access to your genitals?
Without access to my genitals. Prove that I'm a woman. And use a metric that defines woman unilaterally across the board that has no exceptions, and no one could do it because it's impossible. It can't be done because gender is not a binary. It's a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of perception that people have based on societal norms for outward appearance and behavioral outcomes. And all of those can be augmented and changed. We are sexually dimorphic. Like, biologically, we have sexual dimorphism to a certain degree, but even that isn't set in stone
Yeah,
at all. And nobody can do it because it's not actually fucking possible. And it just infuriates me because they argue, people that present themselves as though like I'm the pinnacle of logic and I'm just arguing
yeah,
this position because I'm the pinnacle of logic, and apparently you don't like logic even though you say you do, because if you did like logic, you'd acknowledge that gender is a binary. It's not. It's bimodal. It's bimodal.
I always say it's a n-dimensional bimodal distribution, which annoys
That's
people.
hot. Yours were hot.
But yeah, I think with this, this is like one of the main and also most complicated ones. Is for some people, gender and sex are just interchangeable words, and like colloquially, they kind of are. Sometimes it'll say, what gender are you on a form, and you'll just write female or woman, and sometimes say what sex are you, and you write female or woman,
Yeah.
But for some people, they're very distinctly different, and like particularly for like radical feminists, they're two very separate things. And that often means when you come to a conversation with someone, you instantly don't know what they're talking about, because for some people, gender means genitals, and for some people, gender means like your haircut and your makeup and all this kind of stuff, which is totally like just separate.
Yeah.
But the thing is, even if we just get rid of those two words, and we say, I'm gonna get this big like box over here and put all the women in it, and I'm gonna get this box over here and put all the men in it, and whatever metric you want to use, you can use anything. You can pick something that you think is gender and it's just performance, like hair length, something completely nonsense, which obviously doesn't split people. Or you could use chromosomes. You could pick something really super scientific, or genitals, anything. Now just tell me what thing you have used to sort everyone without exception. That is quite important into these two boxes. And there is literally nothing. There is nothing, even ignoring trans people, even ignoring intersex people. Actually, I slightly take that back. But even ignoring trans people, there is nothing that sorts all men and women into two boxes without exceptions and without an ambiguous thing. I mean, you could do it. You could say everyone taller than 5'5" is a man, and that would split all humans into two boxes, but it would be nonsense. And you could do the same thing with something else. You can pick like chromosomes. You can say everyone who is XY is a man, everyone else is a woman. But then you find an example of a lady who grew up to the age of 40, she's had 3 kids, and then she discovers she's XY. Well, then you're either saying she's a man and she's given birth and she didn't even know she was a man, which obviously makes your whole categorization system completely nonsense, because that means no one truly knows if they're a man or a woman. Or and it just turns out that any single thing they pick just has exceptions. And so often they'll say, exceptions don't count. And that's literally what people say to me all the time.
Or it's 0.00 whatever. We can't look at that.
They'll say it's rare, and then they'll say something like, 0.1%. And you're like, there are 7 billion people on Earth. Yeah. Like 0.1% is millions of people.
And that's one metric. And usually the 0.1% is just when they're talking about intersex people. And it's like, that is still millions of people. And that's one metric. And you're narrowing yourself down to one metric. And if you actually extrapolate that out and utilize that one metric, like even like you utilize the XY metric or whatever for your definitions, you still can't stringently stick to it. And if it without having attribution errors all over the goddamn place. Like I challenge anyone, prove I'm a woman. What metric are you using? Find a definition. There isn't one. Like it's the definition is so ubiquitous that like they're like overlapping clouds in my mind. Like where people can utilize sort of stereotypical aesthetic attributions and behavioral attributions to determine, okay, I put you in this group. And we're humans. We like categorizing people, right? We like categorizing things. So it's very difficult for us to understand that, okay, there's not 2 distinct categories. There is a spectrum until we really look at it. And some people, when they really look at it, just can't wrap their head around it. And it is logical, and it is scientific, and it is biological, but they still just, for whatever reason, and that's what confuses me. Like, for what conceivable goddamn reason do you even give a shit? Like, what
Yeah.
motivates them?
Well,
Like,
there's
why?
a few reasons why people care. And I think possibly the most common one, um, particularly in straight men, is like lots of people just want to know whether like they can have sex with you or not. With you a chat like was it like in like it's just a mammal thing. It's probably in all animal things. Is,
Yeah.
are you a competitor or are you a possible mate? And
Okay.
like your brain, you've got this proper like lizard brain thing going on, you know, to recognize like human brains can gender people or sex people very quickly.
Right.
And you do it, and sometimes you get it wrong. But obviously, it's something, it evolves. It makes sense. Like, am I going to have to fight this person, or am I going to possibly be able to have sex with them? And I think that just the people want that category. Like, I think it's just kind of some, you know, desire for it to fit, and also especially with like homophobia layered on top, is that they think, oh, this person is sexy and I could have sex with them. And then they're like, oh, but they're secretly a man. That means I would be gay. So I can't admit to it. So now I'm angry and now I've got to tell them that they've got to go. And I think like often it is literally just that brain dead reactionary. Yeah. I think maybe more of a more thoughtful position, which is the like the radical feminist, trans-exclusion radical feminist, the TERF position,
right,
is that if you start from the premise of like the radical feminist position, which is, you know, women are oppressed for, you know, being women, basically. Mm-hmm. Not just that, but also, you know, typically men commit most of the crimes, and most of the crimes against women are from men. And, you know, there is lots of premises that the viewers at home don't have to necessarily accept, but this is a position that people come from. And in order to, they can say, well, you know, I accept you as a person, and you're allowed to do anything you want to do with your body, and you're allowed to dress in any way you like. However, in my mind, there are these two groups, and one of them is more dangerous than the other, and one of them oppresses the other. And that's an important distinction for me. And, you know, when they've created this like black and white binary, I think, you know, there are trans inclusive radical feminists who recognize that it isn't this black and white, which, you know, you have to. But I think when someone is coming from a radical feminist position and they've really onboarded this kind of, you know, there's these two groups and this one's, you know, whatever, you know, the dynamics and stuff. And they're like, oh, but some of this other group are trying to get into our group. I don't like it. And I think that's probably one of the next most common, like, oppositions to the idea of people transitioning.
Do you think it's because they want to see themselves as distinct? Or do you think it's because... See, I find it, I'd always try, and it's something I struggle with. I always attempt to put myself in the other person's position to solidify their arguments so that I can figure out where they're coming from. But sometimes that puts me in a position of weakness because articulating them sometimes is a bad idea. So I'm hesitant to do it.
Yeah.
I don't understand where, and also I don't understand because I see frequently the safety thing, and that annoys me on two levels. One, because trans women are statistically more likely to actually be unsafe in women's spaces than cis women are. Like, they're more and definitely statistically by miles more likely to be unsafe if they're in men's spaces. Like, by miles.
So some people will just as like a slight aside, some people will disagree with that statistic, regardless of whether it's true or not.
Okay, it is.
But
it's true.
something I would offer up as like a thought experiment, if you're kind of like suspicious, is and ask any trans woman, would they rather, it from the perspective of safety, if they're walking past a group of men, are they secretly wishing, I hope I'm passing, or are they secretly wishing, I hope I'm not passing? And to any cis woman, so I offer up to you, next time you're nervous and you're walking past a group of men at night, say, I'm not a cis woman, I'm a trans woman. And do you now feel safer? Does anyone ever do that? Has anyone in the entire history of humans who's a cis woman said, I'm a trans woman, and then felt safer? Like, no, like, because anyone could do it. Like, you know, some trans women you can clock and some you can't. not, you can't always tell. That's something that I was hashtag we can always tell when anyone claims that they can, because you just can't. It's just a fact. Some people you can't tell are trans. And any cis woman or cis man could say, I'm trans. Do you now feel safer? And like people will sometimes come at you and they'll be like, well, actually recorded in like, Brazil last year, there was only one trans murder and there was like 10,000 cis women murdered. And obviously it's because the statistics are trash. But, the thought experiment also backs it up. And my other comment on that would be, people often just present this statistic. They'll say, well, actually, they'll pick some random year bracket in some country or something. Like the UK has a very low murder rate. And they'll say, well, last year, no trans women were murdered or something. So the statistic's very low, whereas loads of cis women were murdered. You can, wait, I've forgotten where I was going with this. Oh, you can just be like, are you doing a feminist analysis on this? Like, do you believe that the rape rate per capita is higher in Sweden than it is in Saudi Arabia? Do you actually believe that? Because that's what the statistics say. But any feminist, like probably anyone who's not like some idiot, would be like, well, obviously they have different metrics for what counts as rape. And Saudi Arabia has a very low reporting rate, and Sweden has a very high reporting rate, and it has much higher gender equality. And anyway, so sorry, it was a bit of a side.
I think a lot of that is predicated, in my mind, and this is just what I'm assessing based on interacting in these sort of dialogues for a while. A lot of that seems to be predicated, in my mind, on the false assumption that trans women are men and are thus stronger. So they would be less afraid because they're physically more capable to defend themselves in those situations, because which isn't the case. But that's what they predicate those arguments on, is the assumption that trans women are men. Like that's the underlying assumption that they utilize to
definitely
to keep those arguments going. So what's the best way to knock that down, do you think? No, like, not to put it on you, I have my own ideas, but you're so good at this.
Like, it depends how someone's coming at this. So if someone, like, lots of people do just have the premise, like that trans women are men. That's I would say the majority of people who argue online, that is the premise. It's not their conclusion, and everything else is built on top of that. So it's very hard to counter someone's premise, especially when it's like, in some contexts, this is like a philosophical assertion, and like you that's very difficult to just tell someone they're wrong about that. You can provide all these examples. I mean, one thing that I always like bring up is that people often try and go into the biological argument, or they'll try and make similar arguments about that. But the important thing is that trans women, whether you think they're men or women or not, face misogyny. They face misogynistic sexism and sexual violence. You can't always tell who's trans and who isn't. So obviously, regardless of whether you think all trans women in the entire world are men or not, when they're getting raped and attacked by their partners or anything who don't even know they're trans, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether they think they're a man or woman or not. They're still getting raped. They're still getting beaten up for being a woman. They're still getting fired from their job for being a woman, or not hired because someone thinks they might be about to get pregnant. And so there's always, I try and, especially when I'm talking to feminists, trans exclusionary radical feminists or gender critical feminists, that's, a point I try and bring up. But if I was talking to some, like, I don't know, idiot at the pub, I guess I wouldn't necessarily use that argument. But yeah, it's hard to say. What were you gonna say about it?
So the approach that I take, and you can let me know what you think about it, is similar to the approach that I took when talking about proving gender. And it overlaps with your talking about, please do. Let's both drink break. I'll say like.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're good. That's fine. The approach that I take is, shouldn't we just be concerned about general safety?
Yeah.
And if you're concerned about general safety, why is that gender exclusionary? Like, why would you approach safety as though either group is more likely to offend, like men or women. Shouldn't we just make policies that keep everyone safe?
We should.
Right. So if that's the case, you have to demonstrate at that point, this is my logic and it could be faulty. You would have to, at that point, if you're talking about simply policies that keep people safe, you would have to demonstratably prove that trans people, men, female, non-binary, are demonstratably more dangerous, that they are a threat and should be considered in safety policies. And that's not something you can do statistically. People cherry pick. Like they go in and they find the 1 or 2 cases and they throw them in the forefront as though they're an example of the norm, as like, this is what happens, like the Jessica Yanives of the world, right? People throw that up and say, see, like if you just allow trans people to exist as humans and live their lives, then this is what happens. When people are shit all across the board, you're going to find crappy people, but that's not a sign that whatever demographic they belong to follows their behavioral pattern. That's a sign that that particular person that you found is shitty, but you're utilizing that to predicate and continue on the efficacy of your argument. So you can't actually pull those statistics. I don't know. What do you think about that tact?
Well, I guess like with crime statistics, it's very easy to look at a number and just jump to a stupid conclusion.
Yeah.
So for example, like a very classic like idiot knobhead on Twitter argument would be like, oh, black people in America commit more crime, therefore they're more violent.
Yeah.
But there's so many factors to that. Like, and one of the biggest ones is racism, and and how that affects so many different things, and
socioeconomic
more likely
degradation,
to be poor, and more likely to face abuse, and less likely to have a good neighborhood, and all these kinds of things, which all add up. And even if you can just take things like race totally out of it and just be like, well, actually, if we just look at average income and like location and all these other things, that completely predicts it.
Yeah.
And so you often see like things where someone will say, well, actually, trans women commit more crimes than cis women. And firstly, the statistics are probably terrible, because there will be trans women who get recorded as men, and some will get recorded as cis women, and it's very hard to actually have the statistics for who's had crimes committed against them and who's committed crimes. But even when you get past that, like, trans people are significantly poorer on average than cis people. They're faced a lot more discrimination, even in countries with regulations like the UK. Trans people still get fired for being trans. I know several trans people in the UK who lost their job for being trans. And across the world, and particularly in other countries, sometimes that's just it. It's the end of your career, it's the end of your family and everything. And that makes people turn to crimes. It's the same reason that LGBT people in general have a higher drug usage, because they're more likely to be discriminated against from their own families. And if you look at people who are discriminated against from their own families taking sexuality and gender out of it, they're more likely to use drugs. So it's this whole complicated mess. And if you just pick a single statistic, like something I often bring up is left-handed people are more likely to commit crimes. They're more likely to commit like crimes across the board. So does that mean left-handed people are more dangerous? Should we start segregating left-handed people away from people? They used to, historically, people used to think left-handed people were evil. So it's traditional. It's a new thing that left-handed people are equal. Left-handed people are more violent. Left-handed people are more likely to get arrested. They're more likely to rape people. They're more likely to be mass murderers and all this kind of thing. But it's just so ridiculous, because that, why would you pick that one thing about someone that you can't even tell necessarily without asking them? And there's so many other factors in it involved in it.
So like I'm naive enough to think that people will take a nuanced approach and analyze everything, that's a weakness of mine. That's my kryptonite, is being naive enough to think that people are going to take a nuanced approach to things. That is my kryptonite. So I appreciate you giving me feedback.
Assuming that people are interacting in good faith.
Yeah, that's dumb, right?
I think Yeah, I think like quite often someone, like I was saying earlier, with the premise that trans women are men, which is always the premise isn't ever trans men or women. Like that's the side effect. They don't care about that at all.
Right?
The premise is trans women are men, and they're looking for a reason to to make them feel good about it. Because basically what they're saying is there are plenty of people across the world, in the UK, right today, who I talk to, who genuinely just want to take away the rights that trans women have today. They want to, do what they did in North Carolina in the US, ban trans people from using the toilets. Trans people in the UK have been legally protected to use any toilets that fit them best since 2010, and before that there was no regulation. So we've never been banned from the toilets, but people want to bring that regulation in, and that would just straight up take away someone's rights. It would ruin people's lives, just straight up. And there are some people who, you can tell that to them. Like literally, I know hundreds of people whose lives would be ruined by this, and it won't affect you at all. And you're advocating for this. And so they need to look for some kind of justification for it. They need to say like, oh, well, it's actually because trans people are more violent. And like, but they aren't more violent. What you're doing is you're showing me this one particular study that they always show in the UK where like a certain percentage of trans people are sex criminals or something. And it's like, well, let's analyze the statistic. The study's by some bullshit like prejudice source to start with. And when you've said sex crimes, that also includes prostitution, and trans people are more likely to be prostitutes, like significantly. And that's a crime here, and if that you count that as a sex crime, and then you're trying to spin it as a violent sex crime, which is completely different to prostitution. It's all coming up with justifications for their premise rather than the other way around.
And if I heard you correctly, there was no prohibition before, and then it was explicitly stated that there was no prohibition. So really nothing changed except for they put legislation in saying it's okay to maintain the status quo, don't take it away, it's a right. And they're saying suddenly it's dangerous. Now that it's a right, it's dangerous. When before...
Wow, this is another dumb argument, is so many people like on Twitter, I literally one a day, I would say.
Twitter's poison.
Twitter's trash, but like I still don't think it's even near the bottom of the barrel.
No, you're probably wrong. You're probably not wrong, unfortunately.
Twitter. I mean,
that's just what people say out loud.
But like a very common thing I think I encounter roughly once a day is people who think trans people are new. Like they'll think that trans people are, Caitlyn Jenner was the first trans person
ever.
Like it's some people, like I know this kind of gets into the mental conspiracy theory kind of side of things, but you think Obama invented trans people, or like some people out there think that, and I have encountered them, and it's an experience. But even people without that crazy a view will think being trans is some new thing. I know personally know people who transitioned in the 70s, and they have, they obviously were looking up to people, and they knew people who transitioned before then. And where do you think they've been going to the toilet for the last 40 years of their life? Do you honestly think that what the problem is they're so ignorant. They think it's brand new, and they think that all trans women are just men in dresses, and that's all they know about trans people. They have no concept of trans men or non-binary people at all. And then you say, well, some trans women exist and you can't tell, and you've probably met a trans woman without realizing in the past, and she's been going to the toilet, the women's toilet, since 1976. So where is this if we let men into women's toilets it's going to be daily rape? It's like, well, all of your scaremongering stuff about how allowing trans women to live their lives is going to end humanity, that's already been happening since before you were born. So everything you've scaremongered here is just instantly demonstrating the nonsense, because you're saying if we let A happen, then B will happen. And you say, well, we let A happen how long ago? Years, decades. Like in some countries, since the country's been there, it's just, so.
Or they make the argument that it's that having the regulations in now means that a cis man is going to walk in there and say I'm a woman for the purpose of being voyeuristic and or for the purpose of being predatory, and that people are so concerned about being correct, like politically correct and accepting, that they're just going to allow it. And I very much dislike that argument, because first off, like, studying predators don't just walk into space, not frequently, for sure, don't just walk into spaces where there's a congregation of people and be predatory or voyeuristic. That's just not statistically likely that that's going to be the case. And on top of that, if a woman goes into a secluded restroom, change, whatever, alone at any point, the doors aren't locked. Literally anybody could walk in before. So there's nothing about that's changing. The only reason that it's brought up is to take away people's rights. To say, you know, even though you could do it already, now that I'm aware of it and it's to the forefront of my mind, now that somebody's brought it to my attention, I'm going to think of an argument that's terrifying and act as though it's the norm that people should be concerned about, so that I can fearmonger in order to take away your rights, so that I can feel more satisfied in my ignorant position.
I mean, I often encounter people who are just like that, who it is new to them and they assume it's new to everyone else. And then they're like, well, you know, like, if we just say anyone could be a woman, then what happens if, you know, just some rapist says they're a woman, then what? And it's like, well, what do you mean then what? Like, think what the case already is anyway for trans people. But then even if we just ignore that, even if we just take this out, like, who can go into the women's toilets? Well, anyone who says they're a cleaner, anyone who says they're the store manager, like, service stations in the UK.
Anyone who says that they're looking for their wife or girlfriend or daughter or sister. Or...
And for those, like, a common of sort of the radical feminist argument, when they are a bit more informed, will say, well, you know, we accept trans men in the women's toilets. Well, then anyone can say they're a trans man, like any cis man. And if you want to say I'm a woman, and you're an idiot, rapist, dickhead anyway, you've got, like, the kind of person who thinks they've got to wear a dress or whatever, to say you're a cis man, you don't have to do anything. Like, so trans man, sorry, like anyone can say that. The claims are already available. Anyone can say they're anything, and that's just not how it works. It's not how it's worked for the last 10 years since we've had the law. It's not how it's worked for the last 100 years since we've, you know, had trans people in society.
And if I was a dude, I'd be pissed, because it's also propagating the assumption that men are inherently predators. Like,
but the thing is, though, that there are several segments of society that just accept that as a premise. And one of them, and this is why you get these weird, like, pairings where the MRAs, the men's rights activists, like extremists, like men go in their own way types, and the, like, radical feminists end up saying exactly the same things and teaming up against you. It's like several times. I know, easily over 20 times, I've had a situation where someone who's got feminism is cancer in their bio is arguing alongside someone who says, you know, like, men are a plague on the earth or something in their bio, and they're both arguing the same things and agreeing and liking each other's posts. And the reason is because, you know, some radical feminists, or not just radical feminists, just some people might come from this angle of, like, you know, men are attacking women and men are a danger to women, and, you know, men do commit more crime. You can have that position. There are some, like, often conservative traditionalist men who think, like, you know, the types who would say, oh, I know what men are like, so I won't let any men near my daughter. Who are just they wouldn't ever agree if they heard the radical feminist position, but they just actually totally agree that all men are predators as a premise.
Yeah. And they're also predicating like the idea of strictly constructed gender roles without even necessarily realizing that they're doing it. They're essentially saying that a fundamental attribute of being man is X and a fundamental attribute of being female is X, which ruins the way reality works, because if those are fundamental attributes, you're saying they are. You're saying this is a fundamental attribute of being in either of the boxes. And I love the box analogy, Katie. That's awesome. Like, there's a fundamental, that's how I'm sorting these boxes. A fundamental attribute is predator, victim, or but like less likely to, like, more likely to be vulnerable, more likely to be a predator. Like, these are the fundamental attributes that I'm sorting by. And then when you can find exceptions, like, where do those lie? You're giving those as fundamental attributes to a gender without even realizing that, oh shoot, I'm essentially saying this is a fundamental attribute that we have to look out for in men. So that's what it means to be a man. However, there's all of these outliers, especially if you're an MRA, where you're saying, well, that's not fair that people say that we're just predators. Oh, okay. If that's the case, then you're acknowledging a spectrum of bimodal gender tacitly without even realizing that you're doing it. Holy shit, why are you, like, why? Like, why? Yeah, don't you see it?
Yeah, like, lots of people who are coming in from sort of the conservative position who think gender roles is the same as sex.
Yeah.
They'll have that as their position, like, your gender means to do this, and that's obviously, then they're saying, I'm trying to think how best to explain this. If you are someone who thinks that gender and sex are the same thing, then you're saying that the gender of men is more violent. And if you're someone who thinks gender and sex are totally different, you just totally ignore the concept of gender and just focus just on biology, you're still saying the same thing. It's the same. Yeah. It's the same thing. You're just relabeling it. You're still just stereotyping people based on which box you're claiming they're in, whether that's gender or whether that's sex or whether that's just hair length or whatever. And the thing is
this is how we know we're both women.
Yeah.
We got this, Katie.
Yeah. Like, often people come in from the biological argument and they'll say, well, men are biologically more likely to be violent than women. So what you're saying is, when you then bring trans women to things, you're saying something that differentiates cis men and trans women, even from your premise where we say trans women are biological men, there is something that differentiates these two groups, and it's behavior. No cis men are trying to be women, and all the trans women are trying to be women, and they're not trying to be men. So that's a behavioral difference, and you acknowledge that. That's part of your premise, but you're also saying that they have the same behavior as a premise. And your two premises contradict each other, because obviously, behaviorally, even if you say trans women and cis men are the same group, they're behaviorally different. So you can't make that assertion. You don't know to what degree this behavior differs. Like, maybe the thing that makes cis men wants to be cis men is the same thing biologically that makes them want to be violent. That I'm not saying that's the case, but like, you're making these wild assumptions and premises, which,
and then it's also
for the sake of justifying your position.
They have a predilection of focusing on genitalia as anatomy without actually focusing on your brain as a component of anatomy too. So, like, if you're saying that men, however you're classifying men in that box that you're putting men in, have a predisposition towards violent tendencies, that's not in their elbows. It's certainly not in their dick.
Yeah.
It's not in their shoulders. That would be in their brain. So if you're looking at somebody's neural anatomy and saying, okay, this neural anatomy is what makes you a man or a woman, then guess what? You're starting to argue for bimodal distribution and for the existence of trans people, because there's a myriad of studies that show that trans women actually have a significantly higher amount of white matter in their brain, of myelination in their brain, and which is actually the speed of transfer. And they actually transfer back and forth like cis women do when it comes to like our brains. Can I talk about brains? I love talking about brains. So like,
yeah, I was just going to say IQ correlates with transness. So,
no, it's a true story though. Like men tend to have more, like cis men tend to have more gray matter, and cis women tend to have more white matter, and they also tend to have more interconnectivity between lobes. So the corpus callosum, which is like this like massive nerves that talk between your hemispheres. Like if cis women tend to have a lot more connectivity between the two. So like our hemispheres talk back and forth a lot faster, whereas cis men tend to have a little bit more gray matter, which means that their actual neurons tend to react quicker once the communication gets there. But if you look at trans women and trans men and people all the way through the spectrum, like the stereotypical cis woman brain tends to align very closely with the stereotypical trans female brain, and vice versa. So if you're arguing for a predilection towards certain sort of behavioral manifestations as an indication of your gender and tying that to biological sex, then you're arguing from brains, but you don't know anything about them. And you're actually making a counter argument against yourself without even realizing you're doing it.
They're often making counter arguments against themselves. I think that's a very common. I think like a common counter argument to like the brain argument is people will say pink brain, blue brain is like, you know, is a negative. Obviously, a terrible thing that like. From a feminist point of view, is that throughout history, men have been like, well, women are stupider, women are less capable of being leaders, women are less capable of being engineers, they're not as good at maths, and all this kind of stuff, because your brains are different. And, you know, feminists have worked really hard to point out that's bullshit, and it is bullshit. Like, women can be just good as leaders, women are just as good at maths. All of these things that people just say, oh, your brains are worse, it's just nonsense. But if you are like often the people who will assert this, which is the kind of radical feminist position. I spend most of my time talking to radical feminists.
I'm so sorry.
You know, I agree. I agree with a lot of the reasoning. There is a rational, internally consistent radical feminist position built upon a set of premises. And I think there are two key premises that I disagree with for the TERF position, which then make you a trans inclusive radical feminist. And whether you do agree with the rest of it, I think all the conclusions can still follow. And anyway, but I think if you're coming from this feminist position of, you know, pink brain and blue brain is a bullshit concept, but you're also trying to assert that men are innately more violent and, you know, women are innately less violent or something. You yourself are asserting some kind of pink brain, blue brain. Like, you're either saying that men and women have some nature component to their behavior, or you're not. You can't do one or the other. And as with everything in humans, I'm sure they taught you in psychology, like literally every single day, is once someone thought that this thing was just nature, and then once someone thought this thing was just nurture, and actually it was a mix of both. Yeah. And that's like everything in humans. All human behavior is a mix of nature and nurture, and some is mainly nature and some is mainly nurture. But you can't assert there is no difference between men and women's brains in general if you also agree there are some behavioral differences.
And it also assumes that people assume that like there is no such thing as a pink brain, blue brain. Like when I mentioned like white matter and gray matter, I'm talking about averages on a standard distribution based on population percentages. Now,
not the strict binary.
No. God, no. This is just talking like this is regression towards the mean. So if we're looking at the mean distribution, and if you don't know a lot about statistics, I don't know how to, average would probably be the best way to explain it. So like if you're looking at like the point that hits the average of a distribution, and most population distributions fall in a bell curve, then what I'm saying is that statistically, it's statistically significant that the average cis female brain aligns pretty closely to the average binary trans female brain, and vice versa for men. Like there's points that you can see, but the thing is that it's a distribution. It's not 1 point here and that's where every cis woman is, and 1 point here and that's where every cis man is, and trans women fall here and trans men fall here. It's a full-on distribution.
Sure.
So like when you're making the arguments, like as somebody who's being exclusive, you're acting as though it's bimodal in order to make or binary in order to make those arguments, and you're just discounting the way statistics work, the way science work, the way brains work, and
I think, humans
acting really like you do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, humans really struggle with statistics. I think even if you explain the concept of a bimodal distribution to someone, they still just see it as a binary with a bit in the middle, and they can just ignore the bit in the middle. And humans are very bad at predicting odds. They're very bad at understanding groups, and I think something you brought up earlier, which happens all the time, is someone will be like, you need to apologize for this famous trans person who's evil, and there's a list of them, and I know all of them because I've been demanded to apologize for all of them. But if you can get like 10 or 100 or even 1,000, there is easily 1,000 trans women criminals in the world, and if you show someone a list of 1,000 trans women that are horrible people, like that, for a lot of people who aren't trained in statistics, or even just who don't think about it, that sounds a lot. Like 1,000, I can't. There's like humans can't even imagine 1,000. But when you actually show it as a percentage, it's hardly anything. And like so this is another argument I was going to bring up, which is my least favorite of all of the topics.
Oh,
which is
okay.
sport.
Let's drink.
Is that people will see, oh, this trans woman's just won this sport. This trans woman's just won this sport. Oh no, there's like 10 of them. I could put them all on a single image and say, these 10 trans women have just won. Like, that's a lot. That's quite a lot of trans women. They must be dominating sport. And it is enough to convince a lot of people, because statistics is difficult and it's very hard to conceptualize percentages, and 7 billion people is just too much for anyone to imagine.
Yeah, and outliers get attention. So, and people seem...
That's a good catchphrase, actually.
Outliers get attention. They really do, because they're the statistically significant minority is something that people focus on because it happens so infrequently that those who are looking for it will immediately throw it up like, uh-oh, it happened, we warned you. But, guess what? When women compete against women, sometimes some of those women are going to win and sometimes some of those women are going to lose. And if you're looking to drill down to the minutia of every woman's biology in order to determine whether or not you've decided, based on whatever arbitrary metric you've attributed to a physiological woman, cis women are going to be omitted. Cis women are going to be omitted, and I don't think people realize that.
And it happened with Caster Semenya, which is the most famous one.
Yes.
She's a cis woman, and they're trying to force her to take drugs to change who she is in order to compete in sport. And that sport is complex. The difficulty with sport is if you accept the fact that it's a multidimensional bimodal distribution, that means there are some people in the middle who are ambiguous. And ambiguous is a bit of a rude word. I wouldn't ever describe someone as ambiguous. And just to be clear, You know, trans women are women and intersex women are women. You know, if you're a woman, you're a woman. But there are some people that if you pick a metric, that it's difficult to say which category based on that single metric you put them in. And sport, in order to have some kind of fair competition, if we got rid of all of the rules on all sport, then men and women could be competing against each other. And in some sports at top level, that would just mean that women wouldn't have a chance. Yeah. And that's rubbish. And that's why we do have different leagues for some sports. But you have to draw this line, and it is inherently arbitrary. And the unfortunate thing is if you draw this arbitrary line, then some cis women are going to end up being, and trans women are going to end up being disallowed. And that is unfortunate. But if you accept and you say to everyone, we've got to draw an arbitrary line somewhere, and it's unfortunate, but you're on the wrong side of the line, that is rubbish. But if you say to someone, actually, it means you're biologically a man, that is very different. Like Caster Semenya is a woman, and she has to face this idea that the Olympic Commission has said, we've drawn an arbitrary line and you're on the wrong side of it. You know, that would be rubbish in a prejudice-free world. That's still rubbish for her. But also, like, most of the people who agree with it think she's a man, which is just bullshit. Yeah. And there's obviously, race is a factor in that decision. It's kind of bullshit. But yeah, that's why sport is so difficult, because it's inherently arbitrary. Yeah. If you're drawing a line, if you've got a distribution and you're forcing it into a discrete data set, which means if you've got a range of values and you're trying to block it off, like shoe size, some people have feet in between sizes and it's just bad, and all the shoes they ever buy are shit. And other people fit nicely. And it's the same with this. You're trying to fit all humans into two boxes, and that's just not how humans work. And it means some people are going to lose out. And that's what makes.
Do you think that's why people focus on it? Just like came to me as an epiphany as you're talking, because it seems as though maybe one of the reasons that so many people are so focused on it, it's a human right to be able to participate in sports, and B, it's the one aspect of this discourse where you're actually forced to physiologically define woman.
Yeah, I mean, that is true to an extent. I think that
so people point to it constantly on both sides, because that's contentious, because I may not meet that metric. You may meet that metric. You may not meet that metric. I may meet that metric.
Whatever
and
line
it is arbitrary.
Whatever line we draw, if we even let the most transphobic person in the world draw a line, whatever line they draw, some cis women are going to be on the wrong side and some trans women are going to be on the right side. And there's nothing they can do about that. They couldn't draw a line unless they individually named people that didn't end up with that result.
But there needs to be a line. Otherwise, because if there's not a line, then there's just no category for women.
So I think as a general sort of step back is, if in any situation, toilets, changing rooms, like passports or sport, you want to, like police, who is a woman, you only have three options. You either let society decide, like the general consensus, you have some kind of legal process with documentation to prove who you are, or you let the person in question decide. They are the only three options. It's basically, do I decide whether you're a woman? Do you decide whether you're a woman? Or do you have some excuse on a piece of paper to show whether you are a woman or not? That's the exhaustive list of options. And we don't have to use the same one of those three for every single situation. But in some cases, it's less important which one we pick than the other. For example, toilets, if we let society decide, then what that ends up with is what they have in lots of places, is where some angry cis man busts in and attacks some poor cis woman who's just trying to go to the toilet because she's got short hair, or he thinks she's got an Adam's apple or something. And that
white knighting and defending the women.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's some cool maths I can do. If anyone watching wants me to hit you up with some cool maths, just to do with the odds and how likely trans people are to appear in general society, even if you can tell 99% of the time whether someone is trans or not, the majority of the people who you will point at and say they're trans are actually cis women.
Yeah.
Just because of how statistics works. So that's that's the case with this one. And with the documentation one makes sense in some situations. For example, sport, where top level sport, you can ask to see documents of every single person. Mm-hmm. Going to the toilet, you can't. It's completely ridiculous, though some people do advocate for it, to put like a toilet guard in every single toilet, checking your ID. And then the other one is self-ID, which triggers everyone off. But with lots of things, society decides as the default and lets them decide as kind of the sensible position for most things, like toilets and changing rooms and stuff. But with sport, it kind of makes sense to have some kind of process, some kind of legal documentation requirement, because it can be done. But certainly for top level sport, like amateur football or something, or soccer, or whatever you call it.
Soccer. I don't know what you're calling it. That's weird. Football.
Yeah.
They throw footballs. Yeah.
Go down football. Sorry, I apologize to all the English people watching. That was terrible.
Don't you dare. I apologize to all of the Canadian people watching.
Oh, that's a really English swear, by the way. This is a swear. It's my favorite one.
I'm gonna start doing that.
Really good. So what it's from, slight detour, is allegedly is that when England was at war with France, which is like most of our history, was the French people. So English had lots of longbowmen, and French used to catch just peasants who were the bowmen, and they would cut off these two fingers so you couldn't fire the bow, because this is how you fire a bow.
Okay.
So when you saw a French person, you were like this to show that you still had your fingers. And it's just the most like this, like when you're really angry, this is quite a good swear. But it's just so obnoxious. I just love it. Like often when I've seen my friends and like you drive around the house and just you're leaving and they're like waving goodbye and you're like, and then it's so sad. But anyway, what I was talking about, picking like with sport, you out of these three options, you kind of have to go for this documentation process option, because you can't just let the majority of the crowd decide. Like otherwise people are going to be, there'll be argument every time any woman wins anything if they look manly, which usually means if they're not attractive to all of the men watching.
If they don't fit the stereotypical feminine aesthetic.
So you can't have the majority deciding. And if you have this, like raw self-ID, which is rubbish way of describing it, but like what you kind of have in toilets and what does work with toilets and what has worked for the last 10 years, there will be, maybe that will work. We haven't actually ever tried it with top level sport. It is what happens with some sports. There's quite a few like professional sporting leagues where that is the rule. Like if you just identify which category you go in, and it does generally work.
I run a sport league and it works fine for my league.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But maybe for top level
sport, we're not going to the Olympics. We're in our 30s and 40s. We're not going to the Olympics. So
Well, if a single trans woman wins, even if she's in the B team in the over 40s league at like wherever, your small town or something, she'll still hit the news.
Yeah. Dave Rubin will make sure of it. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever they set you this grid of like 20 trans women of one sport, you just pick a few of them. It'd be like, someone in Basingstoke came first place in the over 50s 500-meter jog or something.
I know, but these are the same people, and we talked about this before, Katie, that I'm like, I'm a female athlete. I run a softball league. Sorry, I'm old. Softball league. I play football. That was my British accent. You like that? I play football. I play soccer. And
if you honestly football, you can't say the T and you can't. Well, for my accent, you can't say the L's.
Football.
It's a
football.
And then I don't say the L's either, so I say football. I say W instead. Anyway,
I play soccer, and but what frustrates me, and we talked about this before we went live, is this all of the, it seems like there's an army of cis dudes who otherwise do not pay attention to women's sport what the actual fuck ever. Like, name a woman athlete, most of them couldn't. Like, there's outliers for sure. There's people that are engaged in this conversation that are interested because they like sport or whatever, and are attempting to be, even though sometimes they're not the best at it, maybe attempting to, look at this critically and honestly, if not insensitively, and failing. But for the most part, it seems like cis dudes who are otherwise saying trans women are men and trans men are women, that are just all of a sudden have all of this interest in female sport, but they can't name a female athlete. They don't support the sport. They've never watched it. They don't promote it. They don't go to the games. They just know absolutely fuck all about female sport, but they're super interested in consistently debating what the criteria should be to determine a woman in.
Oh,
it drives me
insane.
No. Uh-oh, what happened?
I'm frozen.
Oh, you're not frozen on my end. You're frozen on your end. Are you back? Well, maybe I'll take the opportunity to read super chats while Katie's frozen. Hopefully you guys all love Katy as much as I do. I think Katy is the best. So I do have a couple super chats, and we are going to oh my gosh, we've been talking for over an hour. Gosh, I love her.
I just cut out. Am I back?
Oh, you're back. But I'm going to take a second to read the super chats.
Okay, yeah, do it.
A couple, and then we'll start.
Well, wait, can I just say my last point one quickly?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Red flag for anyone who's new to arguing with knobheads who suddenly care about sport is, particularly cis men will bring up MMA or UFC. Like, that's always their first thing. If someone opens with that, then you know that they're just an idiot. Like that. There's over 99% success rate on that assertion, I think. Anyway, sorry.
I think that's an emotional thing. Because I think that they're appealing to everybody's sensibilities when it comes to protecting the poor, sad, helpless women who men just want to beat them up, and you're just letting men beat up women because they'll argue domestic abuse and stuff. At the same time, I've seen that, and I'm like, these women are knowingly going into the ring to have a fight because it is their career. They are fighting for their career. That's their career, is to fight people.
And they're good at it. I'd like to see all of these guys having to go up against like world champion UFC women's, like it would be satisfying.
That would be fun. Like every single like anti-trans athlete apologist that brings up MMA, you should have to just go around with a woman in MMA and just be like, well, since every man apparently can just walk in there and be a woman,
hormones. Let's see how strong you are then.
Have a go. Yeah. Take testosterone, extra testosterone for a week before, just for fun, just to see. We'll lift your weights.
Sorry to distract you.
No. Don't you dare be sorry. I'm so sorry I'm keeping you. We've actually been talking for over an hour already. So we're going to take questions. So if anybody has questions, please at Shannon Q in the chat.
Some questions, team.
Yes, please. And we'll have a drink. So Vibrantly Brantley said, in the midst of this pandemic, on March 18th, Idaho legislators sent a bill prohibiting transgender people from altering birth certificates to governor for approval. Wow.
So cool,
America's priorities are really.
The UK's transphobes are like, lots of them are just losers and they've got nothing else to do. I mean, that's not just me insulting them.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. And you're suddenly locked in and all you've got to do is harass trans people online. But yeah, for these governors and stuff, it's just so pathetic. Like, especially in some of these states, there's just some kind of correlation between, coronavirus isn't a problem, everyone should go back to work, and trans women don't need any rights. Like, there's definitely a correlation there. It's just... Yeah.
And a lot of it's pandering, I think. Like, pushing something like this through when there's more pressing issues is...
it's a distraction, isn't it? Like,
yeah.
I mean, I hate saying it's a distraction. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but, trans rights instantly galvanizes so many people into having a strong opinion. And you could get caught having a sex scandal, or you could be failing at your coronavirus policy or something, have a trans rights issue, and suddenly everyone's talking about it. And that does work. People do it. But yeah, it's pretty depressing that trans rights are going backwards in lots of places. I know that in general, like I suppose when I was younger, women's rights, gay rights, trans rights were all on the up, and in the last few years, since like Trump and Brexit, you know, that's not necessarily, it's kind of leveled off. In the UK, for example, the youngest generation of adults are less supportive of gay people than all of the other adults. And, you know, in America, they're trying to remove abortion rights. And, you know, this is all linked. They're trying to remove trans rights. They're trying to remove gay rights. They're trying to remove women's rights. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's depressing. I hope, you know, that people can fight against it. There's so many, like particularly with America, because there's loads of different states and they're all pushing their own stupid laws, and they don't seem to learn from each other. North Carolina banned trans women from going to the toilet. It was a complete disaster, and they had to roll it back because it just ended up in a load of cis women getting attacked. And then all the other states are still trying to do it. It's nonsense. So I'm sorry for anyone who's in. Was it Idaho? Did they say?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
It was from, yeah. Vibrantly Brantley said in the Idaho legislature. It's ridiculous. So Melissa says, hi Melissa, says Spectrum in all caps. And
Spectrum crisps all the way from hula hoops to French fries.
And
for the viewers watching, this is my patriotic background because I'm anti-patriot. Nothing gets me patriotic until I go to Europe and they all have rubbish crisps, and I'm like, if I was back home,
I'd have my choice of crisps.
Yeah, exactly. We like honestly, my local supermarket has an entire double aisle of crisps, like just crisps or chips or whatever you call them.
Here we call them chips.
Crisp-related products, like for example, What's on technically crisp, but they're crisp-related products. Anyway, sorry.
And the last super chat is from Puck, and thanks Puck. It says, I'm still learning, but this is very helpful. So I'm glad it was helpful. So I saw one question flash by. Shannon Q or Katy, can you link to any studies that look at non-binary brains? Oh, that would be interesting. I'm non-binary, so I'm curious to see how much of it is affected by things like brain structure and cognition, etc. So that's what I talked about, the spectrum, like when it comes to standard distributions, is there. I don't know if there, I'd have to look. I would have to look at studies, but the fact that that spectrum exists in general and is linked to many manifestations of gender identity through both how, like, brain plasticity and how we learn gender expression and gender identity and self-identity, and adhering to stereotypical norms and societal imposition of binary gender norms, like ultra feminine versus ultra masculine, and how those are enforced as the standards. The fact that brains exist on this distribution is actually very, very strong evidence for people who aren't on the binary spectrum, because it's bimodal. So just the spectrum existing itself, when it comes to neuroanatomy, should be that affirmation for you. You don't even need a study that specifically focuses on that. You just need to recognize that there is a spectrum of neuroanatomy.
With like the concept of bimodal, like it's data itself is just a bunch of numbers, and bimodal is like a human like recognition of what the data looks like. And you can have this thing where it looks like there's these two peaks. Like if we just draw it in 2 dimensions, it looks like these two peaks. But what it could actually be is it's like this, and there's all this noise, and there could be this little peak here and another big peak here. And zoom out, it looks like bimodal, but you could interpret the data as trimodal, or you could find out that actually in these peaks there's some kind of noise on the top here, and there's some kind of noise on the top here, but actually maybe it's not noise, and maybe there are other peaks within peaks. And I think that, like, if someone's going around saying sex is a bimodal distribution, like you say, not only is that, well, it's true, but also it is an argument for non-binary people and intersex people who don't consider themselves male or female, to be valid in who they are. It's also not necessarily saying that there isn't some kind of other peaks or other groups that we can identify and make sense of. It's just that these categories are going to be human categorizations rather than like the data. Like data doesn't, when there's two hills, it's not, that's something that we notice as humans who recognize shapes and stuff. So,
and it all depends on what you're mapping too, right? So when I talk about standard distributions, there's not one type of brain. There's not X type of brain and it always does X thing. You're mapping attributes of either neuroanatomy or cognitive function or neurological structure when it comes to like right, like connectivity, behavioral outcomes, cognitive affect. There's all of these different components of brain mapping that all fall on these different distributions. And the thing is that there's a mean for each of them. And that mean is going to be different for every metric also. So people who look at, like even ignoring sex, people who look at gender as though there's some way where you can just define attributes either cognitively, neurologically, physiologically, behaviorally, and just like Katy said, I love that box nut, fit them into boxes, aren't appreciating the beauty of that spectrum. And they're stifling all of us by attempting to force people to constrain themselves into that paradigm. Not only are you valid, you're necessary. It's not just, I'm giving you permission that it's okay to be you. I am telling you, we need you to be you. And I know sometimes it's hard because there's people around you that are telling you that it's not okay to be you. But the people that are reasonable, we need you to be you. Because we need to recognize the existence of these spectrums. There's nuance in life. And the people that are trying to stifle us from recognizing that nuance and analyzing what it is to be human aren't doing anybody any goddamn favors.
Yeah, sure. Though, just a general aside is, don't ever feel pressured that you need to be open or out. Do it within your own safety and your own moments. Like we obviously do need non-binary people and intersex people and trans people and everyone who isn't all these, that doesn't fit into these two boxes, obviously, to stand up, but also just live your life. That's your main priority.
All right, we have way more questions. Okay, my friend Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic has a question. Oh,
your YouTube.
You Drew? Okay, Drew's a friend of mine. Yeah. Well, when people acknowledge Drew, I get a little upset because we don't encourage Drew on my channel, but that's fine. Actually, I love Drew. Drew's good people. He's really good people. Shannon Q. I've had trans men on my channel before. Oh, Adam. Adam is wonderful. Adam the Atheist. You should check out Adam. He's awesome. And got some transphobic commenters. I want to tell them to just fuck off, but they're the people who I need to educate the most. So do you have any tips for me? It's a good question, and it's one I struggle with too. Do you have any tips for people like me and Drew? And if not, then I can...
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is difficult. I guess what I usually do is try and find out, why people have these views. It's very tempting to tell someone to fuck off, but, sometimes people have someone in their family who's trans and they're not dealing with it well, or they would have seen this thing on TV and they didn't like it, or they've heard that trans women are dominating sports and that they just don't like it. And sometimes you need to, they'll say something, and once you've done enough arguing with idiots, you start noticing some patterns of, for example, if they say, oh, well, what about UFC? And you're like, oh, well, I know exactly where you're coming from. You're probably a bit of a misogynist. You think that any man can, you can be a woman to fight. You can go down that path. And then someone else will be coming in from the feminist angle, and they'll say, well, trans women are a danger to cis women, or they'll say, don't call me cis, which is a very common flag.
We are cis.
oh, don't call me cis. I was going to bring this up to one of the stupidest arguments. Like,
we are cis though, like categorically.
Yeah, so cis just means not trans.
Yeah.
Just like in the same way that on means not off. You can argue that perhaps the grey area in between. That's fine. Like
Okay.
gay kind of means not straight, but it's like gay and bisexual and pansexual. But there's also, there's just it's just a general, you're one or the other term. But so many people are offended by the idea of being called cis. Oh yes, if you
stop it! I'm bisexual, but if I was straight, I wouldn't be upset with being called straight. It just means that I'm.
Quite a lot of people are upset by the word being called straight. I'm not straight. I'm normal. Up. Yeah, well, it's much more fashionable to say that.
Like so it's an ownership of what the standard is, and a designation of everybody who doesn't meet that standard is deviant. Then.
Well, that's one argument, and another thing that motivates people. Like I think the main reason anyone would say that is they're ignorant, and another thing is they don't like the idea of being given a label that they don't have control.
Oh, can you imagine? That's awful.
But there is also an argument which is particularly again from like the I guess the tough position, trans exclusion radical feminist position, is that if I acknowledge that there are trans people and cis people and they're two groups, there is a power dynamic here. And in the same way, if you're someone who looks at things in terms of power dynamics, which as a feminist I am aware of, there is a power dynamic between like white people and people who aren't white, and there's a power dynamic between men and women, and in some realms, the different men and women and stuff. Regardless, if you accept that cis and trans is a power dynamic, then you can analyze that. You can say, no one has ever been fired from their job for being cis. People have been fired from their job for being trans. That's a power dynamic. That's something, there's inequality. And if you don't even let people talk about that, they can't acknowledge it. And like, there are some people who I think are aware of that and they do not want it to happen. And I think if you start saying trans people aren't allowed to work in the military in the US, whereas cis people are, that's obviously an inequality between trans and cis people. And they're like, don't call me cis. It's not cis. I'm just a woman. I'm just a man. Why can't we just say men and women? You're not fired for being a man. Why can't you just be a man? Like, and they just want to kind of deflect away from the idea of even acknowledging this dynamic because, its existence delegitimizes the justification for opposing trans rights. So it's a lot of long words, but when you feel like I want to take away these people's rights and you say, well, that's because you're oppressing them, they don't like it, and that's all implied together.
No one likes being called a bigot.
Sorry, this isn't an answer to the question.
I should answer your question. I forgot for a second.
How do I interact with transphobic people? I guess that some people are just there in bad faith, but a lot of people are ignorant. I think most transphobic people are ignorant. I think I was transphobic in the past. I probably have some transphobic drivers still. It's very hard, it's very ingrained in society. Don't necessarily think that everyone who is transphobic is beyond reach. There are some things that will convince people. There are quite a few people who I've talked to who have had just this preconception about trans people, and you can just point out it's just, oh, Poppy's here.
Hi, Poppy. She's adorable.
She's lovely. I guess if you wanted to get into like dealing with transphobic commenters, there are several paths that they always seem to go down, and once you start recognizing them, it's much easier to deal with them because you know whether they're there in bad faith, whether they've just seen Ace Ventura or something and that's what they think. By the way, I'm allergic to cats and she's going to make me
my gosh,
she's working. You say lovely. But yeah, it is difficult because transphobia is like any prejudice, I guess, is it's a big range of things that people can have, and it's such a common one. Like misogyny is very common, but it's ingrained in society in a very different way than transphobia is. And transphobia is so acceptable. It's so politically acceptable to be transphobic. You know, who's ever been fired for being transphobic? Literally no one. Like,
no, probably
just
not.
doesn't happen.
Well, I'm sure. Hopefully, I'm in Canada. Hopefully, here we're pretty progressive. Like I work in an office environment, and I can tell you that if somebody was in my employ and was making one of my non-binary colleagues uncomfortable and was detrimental to the workspace as a result, they would not be employed by me anymore.
Yeah.
That's a fact. And my company would back me up on that. That's 100% the case.
Well, it's good that that's the case. We had a case in England recently where a lady was a contractor and she didn't have a contract renewed because she was making her colleagues and customers or whatever uncomfortable by being transphobic. And it was quite a big deal in the UK because it was the first time that had come to pass, and she sued them for firing her unjustly and lost. And the judge came out with this amazing quote of, her position isn't worthy of respect in a democratic society, which is quite a satisfying thing to quote to anyone who's defending position. But yeah, it's good to know that some countries have.
Yeah, I'm not saying that everybody's all the way there yet, but people are working on it, so that's good. And I have an answer for Drew too.
Also, I've got one more, so carry on.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, did you want to
do it?
Okay, so my answer is that it's going to be situation dependent. I always attempt to engage with people as though I'm not attributing them any motivation, which is difficult because
often you see their motivation instantly.
Right. But I attempt to remove myself from that initially, and then I can usually glean from the interaction whether or not my initial inclination was right. And sometimes, most of the time it is, but sometimes it was wrong. Sometimes people are having a visceral reaction because they're actually emotionally invested for a reason that I don't yet understand. Now, it's hard, especially when you're somebody who your reactions are scrutinized on a public level. Like, you're not just engaging in hoping to change their mind. You're engaging and people are watching you engaged and scrutinizing how you engage and giving you that attribution based on your engagement style. So
I'm so hyper aware of that on Twitter. One wrong move and someone's quote tweeting you out of context.
Right, exactly.
Back to you for literally months. I've got a couple of people who paste snippets of tweets back at me and they're like, why did you say this? And I've been quite good so far. I haven't actually had anything that's been taken out of context.
Oh,
but yeah,
it'll come.
It will. So the other thing I was going to say is genuine offer to anyone at the moment with my platform size is if someone just wants to DM me on Twitter and ask me something, if you yourself are potentially transphobic or you want to deal with a transphobic family member or you have a question in general, just DM me. I try and answer all of my DMs at the moment.
Wow.
And, I try and answer all of my DMs.
Your Twitter platform is like 2 times the size of mine, and I can't even. I don't know how you do it.
I answer all my DMs that aren't dick pics. Or...
well, I answer those. Just kidding. Don't send them.
I had a funny one recently. I'll send it to you later.
Yes, please.
I'm very prepared to try and talk people through these kinds of things. It can be difficult, even if it's what you yourself are thinking or someone else is. So yeah,
it's difficult because you want to do the right thing. Absolutely, you want to do the right thing, and you want people to see that you're putting up a strong stance.
Just thought something else. Carry on.
I know it's okay. You want people to see that you're putting up a strong stance. Like, this is where I stand on this. But if I'm big on motivations and intent, intent and actions, lining up, right? Like, what your desired outcome is aligning with what your actions are. And if my desired outcome is changing people's mind and bringing them more towards seeing things from my perspective, the best course of action isn't always, for me personally, and this isn't for everybody. Everybody can make their own decisions. Like, if somebody's being transphobic and you want to tell them, hey, fuck you, tell them fuck you. Like, you have the right to do that. but this is the way I look at it personally for just me is if I want to try to align them with me, sometimes people that are seen as reprehensible and having bad ideas or are seen as on the precipice or have had a bad take, sometimes the best thing to do is to maybe for a moment not attribute malice to them and give them the benefit of the doubt and try to figure out where they're coming from and see them as human. They're not, give them the credit that they're not giving other people so that you can prove that it's possible.
Yeah,
to walk past it. But that's not for everyone at all, nor should it be. But it's one of the things that I try to do. I fail at it. I tell people to fuck off all the time, but that's a thing that I try to do sometimes. So maybe
it's quite satisfying sometimes saying fuck off.
Yeah.
I think with particularly people with larger platforms, like cis people with larger platforms, sometimes is good, like, to just say fuck off to some views, because for sure, like I do genuinely think that anyone could change their mind on some things. Like there are some people who just really feel like they're never going to change their mind on things. But I think, you know, if you just the two of you hung out, just the two of you for like 15 years or something, you could probably change their mind on anything.
Right.
And you just don't necessarily have the time to do that. But, you know, people aren't evil. People are wrong and have bad motivations and are sometimes hateful people. And there might be someone who comments on your thing saying something completely bullshit, and, you know, maybe you can like rescue them or talk them around or explain to them why it's wrong, but that might take so much of your time. Right. That saying fuck off can, like, I don't personally do it much, be more valuable, because there are going to be trans people in the audience and other cis people who don't know who respect you and don't know where they stand, and they don't know much about it. And some opinions are like societally unacceptable, even if not in some groups. You know, and if someone says like, well, what if this, you know, there's a trans girl at my school and she wants to use the changing rooms, and what if she rapes all the girls? And just like, fuck off, mate. She's a 14-year-old girl who just, like, she's getting bullied every single day, and she's a normal person, and she just wants to live her life, and she just wants to be with the other girls because she herself is a girl, and she's not some kind of pervert. 14, like, what are you on about? Like, just fuck off. And like, that does often set the tone for passers-by, for other trans people who would be just like, you know, thank you, because you can say to this person, and I often do this, and I think I'm quite a bad example, and probably other trans people think I'm quite annoying about it, is I will argue with them and be like, this is an irrational position, explain yourself. And then they'll say something of like, this is a contradiction of your previous assertion. And that it's not always the best thing to do. It's what I like to do, but it's, you know, sometimes there's a bigger strategy than converting every single person, or converting.
I agree with that. Like, because I think like there's certain things, like reprehensible things that people say, and I'll just be like, you know, fuck off. Like, if somebody says she's a man, that comment's gonna get deleted. That's gonna be gone. That's gonna it won't even get a fuck off. It'll just be gone, right? Like, but there's
bring
like
any man comments, mate. Come on, throw them at me. You're gonna have to delete some, I'm sure.
Well, I hope not. My audience is actually my audience. I love my audience. My audience is wonderful. I'm very, 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 very lucky to have cultivated a really wonderful audience. So, thank you, you guys. You're amazing, and they're super engaged and interested. But there are some people who are like, it's difficult to discern, right? It's difficult to like, well, that's not difficult. But there's a spectrum of people who are just like, yeah, well, did you see this study? Or I looked at this and this is the way that I see it. And they may use ignorant language or they may present data that they see as valid, that they're not couching appropriately. And to just like, it's difficult. Like, it's difficult to discern.
Difficult because the anti-trans like movement in general has managed to position this like idea that trans people can't defend themselves and that they just run away and they just block people and they just, that there's a very valid thing which trans people regularly say, particularly in the UK, is it's not a debate. Like, my life isn't a debate. You're trying to debate whether I'm like a danger to you. Like, fuck off. Like, I'm just a person. Stop. You two are debating me and I'm not even involved in it. It's not a debate. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the concept of being trans is like some kind of, blasphemy. It's not like you're banned from talking about it. And so sometimes if every single person someone says like, well, actually, I maybe slightly disagree with one of the assertions in the thing, and you're like, fuck off and delete the comment, then like, they just like, whoa, what is this, heresy? Is this some kind of religion? That isn't the case at all. And that's why I make such an effort to engage with every single dickhead who writes any stupid thing, because, I think it's totally valid that lots of trans people block all this bullshit, because you get it every single day, like literally every single day I get some wank comment about something. And like, lots of the time now I'm in a position where I kind of find when they're directed personally at me, I kind of find them funny because they're just so pathetic. Yeah. When they're directed at other people see them, I'm just like, just fuck off. Like,
the other thing is too, like when they're directed personally at you, people see themselves in you and take that on board for themselves too, right? Like, I know what it's like to wake up every day and be desensitized to you're a bitch, you're a slut, you're a whore, like you're fucking queer, blah, 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 all. Like, when you wake up every morning to somebody telling you like a pile of horse shit about yourself, you eventually get to the point where you're just like, I'm gonna go get a coffee. But if you're already so distraught, like you and I are lucky, I guess, that we're confident and a bit desensitized, and we feel as though we're to the point that we're like, what, bring it, whatever, we got it. But other people see themselves in us, and I think that to a certain degree might be why they follow us or see us as advocating for them. So when somebody slings something at you or something at me, they feel it too. So we also need to be cognizant of that how we react to that is setting an example and a precedent for other people who are looking to us as an example of something they may not necessarily yet be able to do themselves or want to do themselves or are looking to model. Like, not to say that please don't model yourself after me. That's a bad idea. Model yourself after Katy. Modeling yourself after me is just unilaterally horrible fucking idea.
You want to model yourself after me? I can give you a list of the top 100 death metal albums to listen to. One on this point, I guess, like, it's a bit of a general, might be a bit of a detour, but like growing up, I grew up believing in God and became an atheist at some point, like 16 or something.
Yeah.
And I didn't like heavy metal music when I was younger, and then I grew to like it. And for both of those things, there was a long period of my life, several years, where I was insecure about them. I was insecure about being an atheist, and every time anyone said any religious thing, I had to argue that. I just felt like I needed to rationalize it. I think I might have touched on this before, but I needed to make sure I was correct. I needed to, I just felt insecure about it. And now I've got to the point, just from arguing about it so much, for me personally, that if someone comes up to me and is like, your music's shit, I'm just like, all right. It's just lame. Like, I know people are, I don't care, and they're the people who care the most, but like, I don't care. I don't care if you believe in a God. I don't care if you think your crappy music's better than mine. Like, what? It doesn't affect me. And I am honestly totally confident with them. I don't need to argue about them. I just argue about them for fun sometimes now, because I'm addicted to arguing. But I've been trying to get being trans to that position. I want, like, if someone comes up to me and says, like, Between the Buried and Me are a crap band, no. And if someone comes up to me and says you're a man, I'm just like, well, no. I mean, that's just stupid. And I think reacting like that. There's definitely some fake it till you make it. Publicly, you know, people do send me these comments, and some of them are genuinely hilarious. They try the most stupid things. Like this is one thing, like obviously you would have heard of some of the words like tranny and she-male and like, you know, like the F word and stuff, all these things. But there are some other ones. So there's this one that they use in England now, which is troon, which is Troon. And I just can't not laugh at it. It's just so pathetic. And when someone says, like, you're a troon, I'm just like, okay, mate, like, keep trying. And, you know, I think it's good to react to some of these comments. It's very easy to get into this defensive mindset where someone's like, you're a man, and you're like, fuck off, I hate you. But actually, like, wait, you think I'm a man?
Like, how stupid are you? Okay. Have you seen?
Like, nice try an insult. Like, oh, you identify as an attack helicopter. Well done. Like,
one joke.
Baby's first one joke. Yeah, exactly. Like, whatever, mate.
You're amazing. I love talking to you. I learned so much about how to engage when I'm talking to you, too. And, like, I very much appreciate you here. And I hope that everybody in the chat, I have kept you for almost 2 hours. So...
sorry, I ramble on forever. And
I would too. Like we would just scream until tomorrow morning. So I am going to end it. Do you have anything that you want to impart to people before we leave? And thank you, by the way. Like I loved this. Everything about this, I love.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed it. It's been good. I've run out of rum, so it's time to.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, I guess if anyone has any trans questions, you're welcome to hit me up on Twitter. I'm considering starting a YouTube, but I'm a bit nervous about it, so maybe send me some encouragement.
Send her encouragement, please, for me, because I've been trying to get her to do it for like a month and a half now. So support me, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, come follow me on Twitter. Like, come and argue with me about thrash metal, whatever. Enjoy English crisps.
All right. Well,
appreciate English swears.
Woohoo! All right. I'm going to throw up my end screen. I don't have music yet. Before I do, I always say, help elevate the discourse. And now my end screen's up, and we're still going to talk for a second because it needs to be up for 20 seconds. And I'm a horrible YouTuber. So thanks for coming out, guys.
Listen to thrash metal.